This is a Book Potato interview. Today I am speaking with Helen Llyod. Helen is an audio book performer and actor. Helen, hello.
Hello, Tom. Nice to meet you.
Yes, likewise. We spoke a few weeks ago before this, and we've just been speaking now. Um, and again, what I think maybe a lot of people might be wondering is exactly what an audiobook performer is. Obviously, I'm sure they could sort of make a fairly educated guess, but what is an audiobook performer, and how did you become one?
I think probably the best description of an audiobook performer is a storyteller.
Sure.
Because at the end of the day, that's what you're doing when you narrate an audiobook, is telling the story. It's slightly more complicated than just being a reader or just reading aloud,
Mm,
because you have to, not only do you have to stay true to the author's intentions and tell the story as the author intended it to be told, but you also have to create individual voices along with all the emotional
yeah,
content for every one of the characters. And each of those characters has to be individually identifiable and separate from the narrative voice, the voice of the author, if you like.
sure, sure.
So there's a lot to it. I mean, my background is I was an actor for many years. Um, I then moved into. I mean, I trained as an actor. I then worked as an actor. I then moved into television as a presenter. I then moved sideways into television production. I then took redundancy and moved back into the theatre again, and started doing video production and also tutoring, teaching for theatre students. And then I thought I'd done voiceovers all the way along the line from about 1980. I recorded my first audiobook in 1982, I think.
Oh,
Thankfully now long gone, no longer in existence, because I'm sure it was dreadful. And so I set up a studio at home, um, and I started doing audiobooks again in about 2013.
sure. So that's quite a list of things and lots of experience you can obviously
I
draw on.
reinvent myself. It's reinventions.
Sure. Well, again, I think that's a brilliant thing, and many people need to. You need
Yes,
to
absolutely.
be
Well, it's
fluent.
it's essentially all of the things that I've ever done have been to do with words and language and interpretation and, to a degree, performance. Because even excuse me, even as a television producer, you're directing other people to give the performance. Although I was making documentaries, you're directing presenters and people that are being interviewed to a degree to give the performance that you want them to give. So it's all been to do with interpretation of language and the use of words and conveying emotion and feelings and excitement and information to other people. So in a sense, doing audiobooks has just tied all of those little strands together
Sure.
into one thing that I can do. I've got a good face for radio now I'm older, so it works very well.
um, would you like to mention some of the audiobooks you've worked on and even the documentaries you made plus maybe your favorite ones or ones you think that are
Well,
good examples?
the documentaries, it won't mean a lot to anybody who doesn't live in the Midlands, apart from a few
Right.
of them, because I was working for ITV Regional, based in Birmingham and Nottingham, for
Okay.
what was ITV Central and which became ITV Carlton. But I did 5 series of Waterworld, I think it was 5 series with Timothy West, which was all about canal boats, which was great fun, spending summers running up and down canal towpaths with a camera strung or a set of tripods slung over my shoulder.
Sure.
That was fun. And I worked on the first series of Countrywise with Paul Heine, the network series. Um, and I did lots of stuff, all kinds of documentaries about everything from health and beauty to narrowboats. You can't get much broader than that. But I also, at the same time, was doing lots and lots of narration work for television documentaries. I was obviously very lucky. I was in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
So I did it. I did think I narrated about 50 documentaries for ITV at that time. So that was really, really great. As far as audiobooks concerned, I've done I generally do about one a month.
Sure.
Which isn't a lot in the great scheme of things if you're working in a mainstream studio, because obviously if you're in a mainstream recording studio, you've got an engineer on the other side of the glass,
Yeah.
and it takes you know, the whole process is condensed. You'll do a 13-hour book in 3.5 days. But an awful lot of the work that I do, I record remotely from my own space
Yeah.
in Derbyshire, and I'm working a lot of the time. I'm working for American publishers and producers, so I'm working. I'm I'm not producing it, they're producing it, but I'm recording and doing all of that independently, so I can spread the load. I don't have to
Yeah.
shove the whole thing into 3.5 days. I can spread over 2 weeks, providing the deadlines allow.
Yeah.
And it gives a wonderful flexibility, because it means that if I want to start really early in the morning, although I rarely do, I generally tend to work very late at night, partly because it's quieter, and I think also because of my theatre background, my voice sort of comes alive in the evening.
That's
Um,
interesting.
it sort of works better at night than it does in the morning.
Yeah. Of course. I wouldn't have even sort of realized that. But yes, I'm sure you. That's absolutely correct.
Yeah, I think also I mean I certainly concentrate better in the evening. I don't know whether I have. They used to call it night starvation, didn't they? When we woke up in the morning and your whole body was sort of just not functioning quite. I'm not saying I don't function in the mornings, of course I do, but I tend to get quite. I just don't concentrate as well. It's just I'm not used to working early in the morning, so I
That's
do an awful lot of stuff late
yeah.
at night. Quite often, I'm still recording at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning.
Wow. That's interesting actually, because I would say I'm similar way actually. I get a lot more ideas at night.
Yeah,
Um, and I've never really been a morning person, although recent scenarios has sort of forced me to have to get up earlier and get things done. But yeah, I would prefer to wake up slightly later and
yeah.
work later myself. So yeah,
Yes.
I
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I was never an early riser at all until I had kids. And then having a baby makes you get up early. And now I suppose I burn the candle at both ends. I very rarely sleep past 9 o'clock. And I know that sounds late to a lot of people who do, in
commute.
inverted commas, a proper job.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but for me, that's actually quite. I mean, normally I'm up at about 7:30, 8 o'clock.
yeah.
Um, but
That's
then
good.
I do keep going until 1 o'clock in the morning very regularly.
Oh, wow.
Quite often have a Z in the afternoon though.
Yeah, yeah. You gotta recharge
Yeah,
some.
yeah, absolutely.
No, but again, I think basically it's whatever works for you, isn't it? And that's
Yes, it is.
the
It is. It
flexibility
is.
of doing what
It
you do,
is.
which is
But
great.
but working remotely, being able to work in my own studio, although there's a lot more involved because obviously I've had to learn all the technical stuff as well. Although the television stuff that I was doing was, I mean, I was editing and researching and all of that, so that helps. It gives me that flexibility, and I don't have to talk to myself for 8 hours a day, which is, it's tough on the voice, it's tough on the concentration.
Yeah,
So although I love being in a studio because you've then got some contact with the outside world, and sometimes it is a little bit like talking to yourself in a padded cell, um, it does give me a huge amount of flexibility, which I like. I do enjoy working that way.
sure, sure. Do you have any exciting plans for future books coming up? Something you're looking forward to?
I have, but I can't say anything about them because I don't like to jinx them,
Sure.
and B, there is almost always, with any of the major publishers, a non-disclosure order.
Of course.
So I can't actually talk about them. I can talk about when I finished last week. I
Sure.
finished a book last week for Harper called Hello, My Name is May. And I know I can talk about it because it's already up listed on Audible as coming soon.
Okay.
Um, and it's a fantastic book. It's really interesting. It's a lady who, in her late 70s, I suppose, who has had a stroke, who has lost her power of speech. So 50% of the book is an internal monologue with her and her frustration at not being able to communicate. And the other half of the book is a flashback to her as a young woman, and her marriage, a fairly disastrous marriage, in fact, completely disastrous marriage, and how those two stories get pulled together with the residents of a nursing home that she's in. I'm not going to give the game away or say any more, but it's kind of, I suppose you'd term it a thriller, although it isn't written as a thriller because so much of it is the internal monologue. But it's a really interesting book. It's great. It's a smashing read. I thoroughly enjoyed doing it, and I really miss it now it's gone. It's that's the horrible. That's the one thing. The downside is that you get so involved in these books, and you learn to you are the person you become.
Yes.
The major character, and particularly when it's a first person narrative, which half of this was. So I was speaking as May. I was May. When when you finish them, I really miss them. I really do. And quite often I then go back several months later and read the book again for pleasure.
Yes, no, I can see why, because you've immersed yourself into the characters.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think maybe more authors, particularly perhaps on the smaller spectrum, if there is a spectrum, I guess there is a spectrum of authors, perhaps people that have only just published one book or starting out, or even if they're attached to large publishers, but they haven't had a runaway success, all that sort of thing. Do you think, certainly in the UK, they overlook the concept of having an audio version of their book?
Absolutely. I think there are two things that are working against them. One, I mean, it doesn't happen in the US because virtually, I mean, the figures last year in the US, there were 86,000 audiobooks produced.
Sure.
Last year in the UK, there were 3,700 audiobooks produced.
Sure.
So it's a huge disconnect there. But a lot of the time, what happens when an author, I'm not talking necessarily about independent authors here, when an author is signed up with a publisher, very often the publisher will buy the audio rights, so without the author even having realized. So the author is essentially giving away the rights to the audiobook. And then if the book isn't perhaps successful, or if it isn't hugely successful, the audiobook never ever gets made. But it can't be made because the publisher holds the rights.
Yeah, of course. So
and if they make the decision not to do it for whatever reason, then it never happens. Whereas what happens increasingly in the States is that if the publisher isn't making the audiobook, or if the book is an independent production, and so many of them are these days, the author will get, there are ways and means that the author can have the audiobook made as long as they hang on to the rights. Quite often I get emails. I'll contact an author and say, I really loved reading or narrating the book for audio. And they'll come back and say, oh, I didn't even know there was an audiobook. So they're completely left out of the loop. They have no say in who reads it. They have no involvement in the casting. But they could, if they hung on to the audio rights themselves, or inquired about keeping the audio rights, or didn't just sign them over to the publisher, they could be producing and publishing their own audiobooks. There are so many ways of doing it now, and hiring the narrator that they want to read it, assuming that narrator is available. If an author retains the rights themselves, there are lots of ways, there are lots of platforms and ways that they can get that into audio. Sometimes they pay the full cost up front, so sometimes they pay half the cost up front and then share the royalties with the narrator afterwards. And even if they go through ACX, some narrators particularly narrators who don't have a lot of experience. And also, if it's a genre of book that sells particularly well, will do the whole thing on a royalty share. So the author isn't actually putting any money up front. That what they're doing is sharing with ACX 40% of the royalties with the narrator. So Audible keeps 60%, and the author and the narrator share 40% between them. Now, that doesn't sound like a great deal, but if your book, particularly, it has to appeal to the American audience, I must say, because it doesn't really work otherwise in the UK. But if you do a book that really appeals to an American audience, it can be set in the UK. You just have to know what genres
Yeah.
people like to listen to. If your book sells 10,000, if your audiobook sells 10,000 copies, then both you and the narrator have made a lot of money.
And it's crazy, isn't it? How you were saying that, you know, if they sign their rights away and they don't know that the rights.
Yeah, often they don't even know. And the rights, I mean, what generally happens is if the audiobook is not made within a certain period, the rights will revert to the author. But if the author doesn't do anything with them,
Yeah.
they just sit there. I mean, which is why, I mean, there are companies that trawl for back catalogues, you know, for unpicked up rights, and make the books later on. But to me, if I were an author, I would want to be involved. I would want to be part of that collaborative process as much as possible.
And again, if you've only sold 200 copies of your book, why not make it into an audiobook? Because that might be the launch pad to get more interest in
Yeah,
the book.
absolutely. Yeah. And the two things, particularly now, because there's a thing called WhisperSync, which works on Kindle, for example, where you buy a reader will buy the Kindle, the ebook, and they can swap between the audiobook and the read book and reading it themselves. So say you're in the middle of, you know, a fantastic book that you really don't want to put down and you have to drive to work, or you're going on you're going on holiday and you can't wait for a whole days of driving. You just put it in, you put the audio version on, so it'll you read the first chapter and then you listen to the next 4 chapters as you're driving, and then pick up your reading at the end. So there are great interactive ways of still being able to read and listen, which it just opens up a whole new set of doors. And of course, a lot of people, it's not that they struggle with reading, but perhaps, reading in bed is uncomfortable because you have to wear specs. Or maybe, your partner is asleep next to you and you don't necessarily want to turn the light on. Audiobooks are a wonderful way of doing it, as long as you have headphones, of course. So I think the Brits are catching up slowly to listening with audiobooks. But when I speak to people in the street or tell them what I do, an awful lot of people still go, oh, talking books for the blind or books for people with a visual impairment. And that's no longer what it is. Obviously, that's a huge part of it. And it's wonderful to be part of an industry which is allowing people who have visual impairment to be able to have access to books. But it isn't the only reason for listening to books. A performance of a book can bring it to life. It can also destroy it if it's not a good performance, but a good performance of a book can really lift it off the page. And increasingly, I think people find that books that are perhaps difficult to read, or very long books that, require a lot of concentration, and also non-fiction books for learning, books for all of that. Audio is a wonderful way of bringing that into a much more accessible way of accessing information. Audio is a great way to help people retain books that they're doing perhaps for A levels or GCSEs or at university. It's a wonderful way of making that work more accessible and helping it to stick.
Sure. No, absolutely. And as of someone that has listened to quite a few audiobooks in the past, not necessarily fiction, just either biography or how to do something. I totally agree that it's, especially if it's a fairly well-known person and they're the ones doing the reading of it, you are hearing it in their voice. You are experiencing their history, their past. in a way that perhaps if you're reading it, you just wouldn't get that connection. So yeah,
Yes.
there's a huge area for audiobooks.
Yeah.
And yeah, the UK, needs to catch up more to the US, both in
Mm,
production of and
mm.
embracing
The
of it.
the trouble is, I think one of the reasons why is I mean there are obviously costs involved. It is expensive. You know, people need paying. There are engineers that need paying. There are people who do audio proofing. There are narrators who need paying. And we're not the whole industry is so different in the UK. It's so much more closed. In the US, all the publishers who do audiobooks, they make their information much more accessible. You go on their website and you can see the people to contact, the people who produce the audiobooks. That they've got a much more open attitude
Yeah,
to for people to be able to find out about them. In the UK, you look on the website of any of the major publishers and you've got no idea that they even do audiobooks a lot of the time. And certainly if you want to find out more about them or subscribe about them or find out about the narrators who read their books, perhaps you've got a favorite narrator. Would you know which publisher Stephen Fry works for, or Miriam Margolyes, or what the latest releases of their audiobooks are? No, you wouldn't. Whereas there's a whole industry in America giving that information out. There's a dedicated audiobook magazine called Audiophile Magazine, which obviously people in the UK can subscribe to,
yeah,
but it's largely about American publications. There's the odd British publication and British Voice that gets in there, but largely it's about American stuff. And I'm not saying that isn't good and it's not valid. There's some wonderful American narrators and some great American authors, but it seems to me that there's a kind of I think there's a, and this is going to sound weird from a Brit, but maybe there's a snobbishness about audiobooks, that audiobooks are still not viewed as something as proper. If you listen to it, you haven't really experienced the book properly.
yeah,
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that. I mean, uh, yes, reading a book it's just a different experience, but it
yeah.
doesn't, neither invalidates the other.
No, 100%. I totally agree with that. Um, and you're right. It probably is an attitude, but things change, and I
Yes,
think
they do.
more people were aware of that, or it's the dilemma of, do you wait until the market demands it, or do you introduce it to the market to see if people want to buy it? Um,
Yes, yes.
and yeah, we shall see. I mean, we're interested in doing more with audiobooks in the near future ourselves as well. So hopefully we will now
Yeah,
start.
I mean, I think it is obviously. I mean, it is. I think it grew. I think the market grew by in the UK by 17% last year. So that's a significant increase, and
Mm,
it is growing year on year. Um, you know, but in the States, and also in the UK, people keep saying that audio is the thing that is rescuing the publishing industry,
yeah,
because it is. The growth in sales is so huge there compared with the growth in print sales. That and Audible, of course, they've got all their deals. You sign up and you get a free book a month, and all of this. All of that is feeding into that increase in audiobooks, and it is in a lot of ways. It is. It's a way that the publishing industry can continue to generate income and can continue to generate copy, because there are now authors who are writing books that are coming out in audio, writing books specifically for audio.
yeah, yeah,
So, because the problem with a lot of books, the translation into audio doesn't always work, because very often in a print book, you'll have something like, and I'm going to exaggerate, "Don't come near me," she said through gritted teeth while eating a cheese sandwich, um, and, with an angry frown on her face. Now, as an audiobook performer, you can't play that. And
yeah,
you don't need somebody to tell you how to say, "Don't come near me." So a lot of the time, the attributions and the how somebody said something in a print book get in the way of the audiobook, because once the listener is engrossed in it, they can hear how something is said. They don't need to have after it, "He said angrily," or "He said through tears, or she said, you know, in a whisper. You can hear how it's being said. So a book that is created for audio, the author will take all of that out, and it becomes much more immediate. It becomes much more like a drama.
Yeah, yeah,
So that's really exciting, I think, that authors are actually creating books, and also creating books for more than one voice. So you have, perhaps a chapter by the male, the hero of the book, followed by a chapter by the female, and then a section of dialogue between the two of them, with
mm,
a third narrative voice telling the story. And that's a really exciting way of bringing audio and making it even more immediate and more exciting.
yeah, yeah. I think there's so much opportunity. Just as I said, just to do it differently.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
do you have any advice for aspiring authors who perhaps would like to have an audio version of their book? Certainly if they're independent authors.
Just look online, because there are lots and lots of organizations. There's ACX, which stands for the Audiobook Creation Exchange, which is an Audible company, which in turn is an Amazon company. There's a company called Find a Way, which is an American company, which allows authors to self-publish. There's another one called Authors Republic, which allows authors to publish. There are lots and lots of ways of doing it. So just look on the internet about the options for making an audiobook as an independent author. Um, and also as an author, as long as you retain the rights, or the rights have been given back to you, you can make the audiobook 3 years, 4 years, 5 years after your book has been published. If the publisher has released the audio rights and hasn't made the audiobook, you can do it. So, if you had a book that you wrote 5 years ago, which has not come out in audio, why not do it? Why not look at it now?
Yeah, sure, sure. I agree. Um, Helen, I think it's been fascinating speaking with you about this. There's so much more we could speak and scratch the surface, and we'll probably
Well,
have to.
perhaps we'll do number 2 at a later date.
Yes, absolutely. But Helen, I want to thank you for your time. If anyone wanted to follow you or contact you, what's the best way to
if
do that?
if they just have a look for Helen Llyod Audio, it's called I am called Helen Llyod Audio, and I'm on Google, I'm on Twitter, I've got a business page on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, I'm on LinkedIn, and I also blog regularly about audiobooks from my website, which is helenlloydaudio.com.
That's fantastic. Helen,
And also, of course, my books are all on Audible.
oh, of course, of course. Yeah, listen to one of the books you've worked on first, perhaps. But that's brilliant. I think there's tons of information there and stuff that certainly I've learned about. So, Helen, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Tom. It was an absolute pleasure.